Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Mercola, and I am here today with Dr. Chopra, who is an amazing health advocate. And he is currently located in Canada, but he has an illustrious history in helping people understand the health truths and really seeking to implement health freedoms. And he's actually trained as a veterinarian and has worked with the vaccine issue quite a bit and was part of Canada's, was it the public health program that they had there for a while. And because of his health advocacy, he was actually removed from their program, and now he seeks to fight independently to help share truths. And we're here and Dr. Chopra, you can modify and update what I just said for your background, but we're here today primarily, after you do that, we're here today primarily to discuss your new book, Corrupt to the Core, and some of the implications that it has. So, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Mercola. I wrote this book. It's a running account of my own personal history in science from age maybe 3 years up to now, and I'm now 76. Mm-hmm. So I can divide my life into two halves. The first half was joy of learning science, many kinds of science, becoming a veterinarian, training to be an expert in vaccine safety, still in India, coming to McGill University in 1960, Canada, and taking a master's and PhD in microbiology, going for a postdoctoral fellowship in allergy research. This is our human area. And then from there, still in Canada, I was hired as head of biological research for an American large pharmaceutical company of those days, Miles Laboratories. These are the people who used to make Alka-Seltzer. Now they're owned by Bayer. And so I worked there as head of biological research for 4 years. And in '69, I came back to Canada, where I was invited to join the Food and Drugs Directorate. At that time it was called. And the idea was, now, after 1967, after the thalidomide affair, now both in the United States and Canada, there was going to be very rigorous health safety standards for all drugs including vaccines. In fact, in that sense, Canada was ahead of the United States, that they started to consider vaccines as drugs. So my job is going to be to evaluate as a senior scientific advisor in the Department of Health, Food and Drugs Directorate, antibiotics and vaccines for people. And this is the moment I joined. This is the greatest irony. Having learned all those sciences in all those years, the first vaccines that land on my desk were rubella and later on mumps and some later versions of measles. And I objected to them. And I said, I see problems in these because these are minor diseases and people get immune by age 15, 85% of them. Why are we going to give these vaccines which have never been tested? And I knew they were made in monkey kidney tissue, and we'd had problems with the polio vaccine. And the adventitious viruses, they were a serious concern to me. And nevertheless, Merck, at that time actually there were 3 companies trying to make the rubella vaccine. It was Merck, SmithKline and French, and Burroughs and Wellcome from England. Eventually, only Merck got approval. And of course, my suggestion was, why don't we test women at the age of 15, 16, and those who are not yet immune, then maybe give them vaccine. But of course, the companies didn't want that. They wanted 100% or at least 80% of the children vaccinated. And that was the only way they were going to make money. And so they flew in hordes of people from the United States. Of all people, Dr. Hilleman, you may remember. Sure. He himself came, and he was effectively yelling and screaming at my department that the United States had passed it and so forth. In any case, the vaccines were passed. We now know from history that those vaccines have been used for more than 40 years, and the diseases, all of them, are still here. Meanwhile, autism, diabetes, and all kinds of autoimmune diseases have increased. So we don't know what damage we're doing, but actually we know that in association with those vaccines, chronic diseases in children have increased. But nobody's paying attention. Everybody's denying that. Anyway, I suffered that. It was put into history. And then there were antibiotics. Once again, see, we talk about medical advancements in the 20th century. It's true. They started to occur at the beginning of the century. And the greatest advancements occurred initially with the findings of pathogenic microbes that cause diseases, and they used to kill children. 36% of the children used to die before the age of 6, 200 years ago. And when it was found that there were all these organisms killing, and that incidentally, people forget, that was due to concentration of people, children working in factories and dingy places and cotton spinning factories and so forth. They all like to forget that's how disease was spreading. In any event, this went on for a long, long time. And then back in 1971, there was an investigation in the United States that influenza vaccine was not working. And there was one man, Anthony Morris, a scientist, senior scientist, was fired. And then an investigation occurred, and there was a congressional inquiry and looked at 200 vaccines, and they recommended that they were all useless vaccines. Ironically, those vaccines have never been removed from the ledgers, and DPT was never talked about. And so, again, medical people know, a lot of scientists know, the CDC, US FDA, other departments, medical professionals, they're all denying that all these infectious diseases had started to come down in the early 40s. And by the time these vaccines were introduced, the death rate had virtually come down to negligible amounts. And now, the other thing that had happened for bacterial infections, pertussis, etc., we now had antibiotics. Now, talking about antibiotics, again, penicillin was discovered way back in 1910 and then developed not until 1945. And then other antibiotics came on scene, and the country that actually developed, you have to give credit to the Americans. I have to give credit to the Americans. When they see a good thing, they put their money on it. The British came. They said, we have penicillin. We don't have the money because of the war to develop it. Could you invest in it? And the offer was made. Yes, we will do it for the good of humanity. Let's make penicillin, but there'll be no patent on it. In fact, they ruled that anything made by natural organisms, no organisms and their products cannot be patented. But you can patent processes if you make something chemically. So penicillin was discovered from a mold, Penicillium, and but it wasn't effective against all bacterial infections. There was tuberculosis, there was all kinds of other things. So then scientists ran around looking for other molds, and then they found them. Streptomycin was found, tetracyclines were found, a whole bunch of other antibiotics were found, and they said, now we can, but then once again there were no patents, so the companies couldn't make money. And then they came up with the idea, the British came back, they said, well, we took the penicillin and we changed it chemically, and we will call it ampicillin. We now want a patent on that. So the US told them, yes, that's true, but one of our companies discovered the same thing at the same time, so there'll be 2 patents. They said, okay, let's go ahead. One to Bristol and one to Beecham. And then they took tetracycline. It was changed to oxytetracycline, chlortetracycline. Pfizer got one, Cyanomed got another one. So in other words, they started to divide up the all these monies coming out of that. But the main antibiotics were sidelined, but these products were put on the market. What happens during this period, the same period, early part of the first half of the century, human body, human physiology was mapped. We now had other products as well. Insulin, for example, was discovered in Canada, and other hormones were discovered, vitamins were discovered, all these things were discovered. Now scientists went to work. They said, we're going to break down all nutrients, all foods, and break them down to individual constituents so that we now have proteins, we have carbohydrates, we have fats, we have vitamins, and we'll reconstitute. And that will be good nourishment. That will be the perfect food, and milk will be, for even babies, will be formula milk and so forth. All these so-called developments, actually, we knew they were actually harmful, but they were promoted as great discoveries. Then come other hormones, diethylstilbestrol. It was already discovered in the 40s, and then they were starting to use diethylstilbestrol to prolong lactation in cows. And then they discovered, this is not a good idea. This was producing mammary tissue in men. This was happening during the war. Then comes DES. They tried to use it as a prevention against threatened miscarriages. It didn't prevent miscarriage. But 20 years later, we discovered that DES would actually cause a huge incidence increase in endometriosis and cervical cancer in girls born from the mothers who had received DES at that time. So you can imagine how the scientific discoveries are going awry from the beginning. And then hormones continue to be used in food-producing animals. At that time, in the 50s, they were given to chickens and pigs and cows and whatever. They were receiving huge amounts. Then it was discovered, there were studies done in Puerto Rico, that this was producing serious harmful effects in producing reproductive disorders in boys and girls. Ultimately, DES was banned in 1973. But at the same time, they came up with other hormones. They started to feed them instead. Melangestrol, MGA for short. So if one hormone is bad, how can another hormone be good? So these kinds of discoveries went on. And then the 80s, not only that, they took the actual sex hormones, just like the large birth control pill. In addition to feeding MGA, they started to inject them, plant them behind the ears for the whole life of beef. Then they started to use hormones to synchronize their estrus, pigs and cattle, so that the farmer could breed them all on one day for the convenience of the farmer. This is factory farming operations. So this kind of thing went on and on. As a matter of fact, it began, the companies now were making so much profit that no benefits were occurring to people anywhere. And countries, United States, Britain, Canada, they were beginning to complain that there was no, and the cost of drugs should be reduced. Well, the cost of drugs, and the companies were saying, well, if the cost of drugs is reduced, we don't have the money to reinvest, and who's going to ensure the